It's easy to run into a modern looking Tesla with falcon wing doors charging at the local shopping centre and automatically assume that electric vehicles are a recent technology, a concept that may or may not take off in the future. In fact, electric vehicle history goes a fair way back. And I'm not just talking about the recent hybrids like the Holden Volt, as it's called here in Australia. In the US, it's called the Chevrolet or the Chevy Volt. It's called the Opel Emperor E in Europe. I'm not talking about the Nissan Leaf, the Mitsubishi iMiev, the recent Hyundais like the Ioniq or the Kona. I'm not even talking about the first gen Toyota Prius, which came out in 1997 in Japan and was released around the world and in the US in the year 2000. It was actually beaten to the US market by the Honda Insight, which was a hybrid as well. I'm not even talking about the General Motors EV1, which came out a few years prior to that. In fact, the EV1 featured in the great documentary titled Who Killed the Electric Car, which is well worthwhile watching. I'll include a link in the description section below, so look out for it there. I'm not even talking about, there was a period between 1974 and 1977. During that 3-year period, the CitiCar was being produced, which was an EV. I'm not even talking about the lunar rover on the moon. That was an EV. In fact, if you Google the history of electric vehicles, you'll get a varied number of accounts as to when exactly the electric vehicle came about. In fact, it's really difficult to pinpoint a specific time because there was a number of inventions and a number of developments that happened in the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. In fact, there are accounts of Ányos Jedlik coming out, I think it was around 1814 with the first electric motor, which he put around a small model car. There's the first hybrid was credited to Ferdinand Porsche in 1900, I believe it was, or around that time anyway. In fact, people don't realize the land speed record was held by an EV up until 1900. And at that time, electric vehicles actually held a 38% market share of all cars on the road. And the second largest market share wasn't internal combustion engines. In fact, it was external combustion engines or steam vehicles. So steam engines actually held a 40% market share at that point, electric vehicles 38%, and internal combustion engines only 22%. But it really was the introduction of the modern production line by Henry Ford and the release of the Model T, I think it was in 1908, that really began that shift to internal combustion engines. And then later on, a few years later, the electric starter motor came out, which replaced the hand crank, which was really quite onerous to get the car to start up and wasn't very dignified way of starting up a car, especially if you were dressed in going out fairly formal clothes, as was the tradition in those days. So that was really the major obstacle to internal combustion engines taking off at that time, and the electric starter motor really began the mass adoption of internal combustion engines. And, you know, as a result of Henry Ford's production line. But in fact, it was Henry Ford's wife, Clara. She actually preferred, as a lot of ladies did in those days, electric vehicles. Reportedly, her preferred brand was the Detroit Electric. In fact, there's a museum not too far from here where there's a 1841 Detroit Electric on show. And there's a sign at the front of the display which has a fairly interesting narrative which explains that EVs at the time were preferred by women, by ladies, who didn't care too much for the offensive smell that came from the exhausts of internal combustion engines of the time. And they didn't care for the noise either. They preferred the quiet drive, the more of a sedate driving style of an EV. So quite interesting. Speaking to the curator and some of the people at the museum, they were saying that one of the reasons why internal combustion engines won the race against EVs as well as steam engines was because the men actually saw a better future for internal combustion engines, because they could see a profit motive in terms of refining oil and selling petrol or gasoline. That was around the time when the world was becoming electrified. Electricity was becoming common in households as well as workplaces. So I guess they figured with an EV you could just plug it in at home. When you think about it, it's quite crazy that we're talking about plugging your EV into a power point back in the 1900s, but that was the technology of the time. That said, all three technologies, whether it was external combustion engines like steam engines, or EVs or internal combustion engines, that they all had their drawbacks. The main drawback of the steam engine was the fact that it would take half an hour to 45 minutes for it to warm up for you to be able to drive the car. So obviously a major inconvenience. Let's not forget that internal combustion engines at the time, you had to start with a hand crank. Possibly another reason why the ladies didn't care too much for ICE cars at the time. But even EVs, and even the fact that they did hold the land speed record up until 1900, by the time we started getting towards the later stage of that first decade, of around 1910, internal combustion engines were faster. By comparison, EVs were quite expensive and they had a short range. In fact, if you look up Wikipedia at the moment, those are the three reasons that they quote as to the reason for the demise of the EV. I actually think it's more to do with one man, and that was Henry Ford and his invention of the commercialization of the assembly line, which led to him being able to manufacture the Model T Ford. At the time, I think it was something around $1,650 or $1,750 Sorry, that was the price of EVs at the time. The Model T Ford was about a third of the price, was around $650. So that really, I think, was the game changer. To have a car that was a third of the price, that could go further. The only disadvantage was the hand crank at the time, but that was soon completely replaced with a electric starter motor. So that was towards 1910, somewhere around that time. So and that really led to the mass market adoption of the Model T and other internal combustion engines later on. So quite interesting as to the history behind all cars really, but EVs in particular. Just a real shame that we didn't listen to the ladies of the era. If we did, we would have been driving around in environmentally responsible vehicles for the last 120 years rather than polluting internal combustion engine cars. But I think we're starting to shift now in a major way. It was really the announcement of the Tesla Roadster around 2010, soon followed by the Model S, and of course by the Model X, and even in Australia we've got the Model 3 coming out in a couple of weeks. So I think the Model 3, it really has been a game changer, and I'm going to be watching with really keen interest as to what the adoption is like here in Australia. I've ordered one. I ordered one on the first day that they came out, so I'm looking forward to receiving mine, and subscribe so you can get videos of my first impressions of the car, which hopefully will be in a few weeks' time. On that note, if you're thinking about buying a Tesla, make sure you use a referral code. It doesn't have to be mine, can be anyone's, but if you use a referral code, you'll get 1,500 kilometers of free supercharging. Could definitely come in handy. Look, of course, I prefer if you used my code, because if you do, I'll get one entry into a draw to win a Tesla Roadster, the new generation Roadster, which I think is going to be a phenomenal car. We're talking about 1,000 kilometers, or about, what is that, 620, 650 odd miles of range. We're talking about 0 to 60 miles an hour, or 0 to 100 kilometers an hour in roughly around 2 seconds. I mean, the car's going to have cold gas thrusters. I think it's going to be an absolutely phenomenal vehicle. So would obviously love to win one. Should I win one, I'll undertake to do exactly what Ludicrous Tom has done, which I think is a fantastic idea, which is to put the car up on a car sharing website. So he's over in Sydney, I'm here in Perth. And like I said, should I win one, I'll put it up on the website so that anyone can drive it, can take it for a test drive, rent it out for a day or two. In fact, when I get my Model 3, I'll probably do that with the Model 3 at some point as well, so that people can take that for a drive as well. So look, hopefully you got some value out of this content. Depending on when I upload this video, it will either be my first or my second video ever made. So hopefully the content gets better and the production quality gets better from here on. But if you're interested in topics such as electric vehicles, sustainable energy, solar PV, battery storage, that sort of thing, technology in general, please subscribe, and please make sure you hit the notification bell next to the subscribe button so that you're alerted to any videos as and when they come out. So like I said, hopefully you got some value out of the content. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Look, that's about it. Stay safe, stay sustainable, stay ahead of the curve. Ciao.